All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for Clean Energy New Hampshire's event today. We are going to be talking about pioneering smart large-scale solar in New Hampshire, lessons learned and moving forward for conservation and clean energy. We'd like to say a huge thank you to our sponsor of this event, VHB, as well as organizations that have partnered with us on this event, the Nature Conservancy in New Hampshire, Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests, and E2Tech, the Environmental and Energy Technology Council of Maine. Thank you so much for your support. Here is a brief overview of the agenda we're going to be following today. We're going to start out with a welcome and introductions, and then we will launch into our first panel presentations. At 10 o'clock, we will have a 5-minute break, so feel free to grab some water or run to the restroom if you need to. We'll come back at 10:05 and complete our panel presentations. At 11 o'clock, we will have a moderated question and answer period with our panelists. And at 11:20, we will have a quick brainstorming session to discuss where we should go from here. And at 11:30, we plan to adjourn the event. So now I'm going to hand it over to today's event moderator, Madeline Minow from Clean Energy New Hampshire. Madeline, over to you.
Thank you so much, Brianna. And it's great to have you all with us today. I'll introduce our panel quickly, and then we'll have fun. We have planned some poll questions to make this event a little bit more interactive. So on our panel today, we have Dave Wilby, who is president of Wilby Public Affairs, Joe Harrison, who is vice president of project development with Rewild, Sherry Treffry, who is energy market leader at VHB, Emily Cole, who is New England Deputy Director of the American Farmland Trust, and Audrey Fredrickson, who is Land Use and Environmental Advocacy Attorney with Scenic Hudson. Thank you all for being with us. We're really looking forward to hearing your presentations. So as Brianna mentioned, towards the end of this event, we will welcome attendee questions. The way that you can do that is click the orange arrow in your control panel, and then you can type questions in the questions box, which I will be able to see, and I will ask the panelists for you. So prepare your questions. Feel free to enter them during the event if you would like, but we will get to them towards the end. So our first poll question is, what best represents your interest in these solar siting topics? Please select one time to answer this. Give us a good idea of who's here and who's listening and why you're interested. All righty. So we mostly have developers and clean energy advocates and folks on local energy committees or conservation commissions or local government and municipal staff, and then a few others. So sounds good. Our first panelist today is Dave Wilby, who is president of Wilby Public Affairs. Dave has been working at the intersection of energy and natural resource issues and public affairs for more than 25 years. As vice president for 2 leading renewable energy companies, Dave led state-level government relations in a wide range of markets across the US. He also played a key role in federal policy related to grid-scale renewables. His role included policy development and advocacy, stakeholder communications, regulatory strategy, external messaging, market development, and crisis management. Previously, Dave was also the executive director of a statewide trade association that represents the renewable power industry and a consultant to businesses dealing with statewide and local referenda. So take it away, Dave.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Happy to be here. And my role here is to talk a little bit about what's happened in Maine, I think in large part as sort of a example and maybe some lessons learned that might be applicable in New Hampshire and perhaps other states in the region. Delighted to be here. I'm based in Maine and involved very much in solar matters in Maine. So I guess that's what qualifies me to speak a little bit about it, but happy to be here today. I'm a New Hampshire native, so always fun to be engaged in some conversation about what's going on in the Granite State. And also, before I begin, I just wanted to tip my hat to Madeline on her leadership over the years of Clean Energy New Hampshire, and wish her well in her next endeavors. So we're going to talk about siting, but I do want to start really by putting it in the broader context, which is to say, in Maine, the experience to date has been that interconnection and transmission, not siting, appeared to be deciding, and probably for a while will be deciding, the future of solar development in the state of Maine. Siting matters, but as I'll outline a little bit here, I think it really kind of falls, if I were to rank the issues in terms of importance and impact right now, interconnection is clearly first, with sort of the public policy issues kind of right on the tail, number 2 spot. And siting is out there, but it really is kind of a tertiary issue at this point, the way things have developed. I don't know enough really about sort of the interconnection situation in New Hampshire to draw direct parallels, but I think it bears noting that as much as we'll talk a little bit about siting, at this point there are other issues that have really been more impactful. So if we can flip to the first slide, please. I suspect most, if not everybody, who's joined us today are at least somewhat familiar with at least the broad brushstrokes of recent Maine solar policy and politics. And many folks may remember that until recent times, Maine was really behind all of the region in solar, and Governor Paul LePage, who was governor through the end of 2018, was pretty, I would say, aggressively and actively anti-solar, particularly on the net metering side. And you can see a press conference here, a little kind of dollhouse model made up to explain to the press the evils of net metering and a PUC decision at that time. So that's where we were. And if we can go to the next slide, in November 2018, an election occurred. Governor Janet Mills was elected, and in her first session, there were a dramatic shift in a number of renewable policies that impacted solar and other clean energy technologies. One bill was a sort of distributed generation focused, which I'll talk a little bit about, and another was a broader grid scale procurement bill, which has led to a significant amount of larger scale grid scale solar coming along in the pipeline. So I don't know whether maybe elections matter is the caption here, but a lot of what we've seen in Maine is you can directly attribute back to this shift in perspective in the governor's office. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I just thought, just to give a little kind of context and overview about where Maine is, and as I just referenced, where it's been. Just 5 years ago, Maine had only 20 megawatts of installed solar capacity in the entire state. It was dead last in New England, and with this shift over the past few years, the political shift and the policy shift. What we see now is a tremendous increase in solar growth. So I've broken it up here on the slide into DG and grid scale, and we have some more DG in the ground and a whole lot pending. Whether I think not all of that, the 1.1 gigawatts that was in the queue. It's a greater number that's in the queue, but the 1.1 gigawatts that were pending with NEB agreements, according to the PUC just a couple months ago. I don't know that we'll all see every last megawatt. I would say no. Some percentage there'll be attrition to that, but still, when you started at 20 megawatts or 50 megawatts in recent times, that's a very big number, obviously. And we've seen a similar sort of growth on the grid scale side. There is a lot under construction and just recently put into operation here in the state. I referenced the 2019 legislation that increased grid scale procurement. That led to roughly 500 megawatts worth of projects being given long-term contracts. And so those projects are, in advanced stage development and presumably will be in construction in the near future. Meanwhile, there's another round of that procurement that's ongoing right now, which I think the smart money would suggest is very likely to result in more solar megawatts coming. So, as in the fourth bullet here note, it's a bit of a, I'll say, educated guess, but I think by middle of this decade, it's pretty likely Maine will be in the 1.5 gigawatts of solar in operation, somewhere in that range. Maybe it's 1, maybe it's closer to 2, but somewhere, if you roll up what's happening on the DG front and on the grid scale, I think Maine is very, very likely headed in that direction, which is obviously a massive amount relative to where things were, less than a decade previous to that. But again, back to where mentioned at the outset, I think perhaps the greatest limiting factor on what that number ultimately will be is transmission, because Maine has, relative to the rest of New England, a lot of room, a lot of undeveloped area, but what it doesn't have a lot of is space in the transmission system, and interconnection opportunities vary quite widely. There are a lot of places where you would otherwise want to put a solar project, which are very challenging to interconnect. There are some places which are more available, but it's a very challenging process right now. And then sort of zooming back from sort of the local interconnection challenges a given project may have, Maine also has broader, transmission challenges in terms of moving massive amounts of bulk power around in and out of the state. So, Maine already has, by and large, more generation than it needs, and this addition of a lot of solar, plus the Canadian, the Hydro-Quebec line, which still subject to a very spirited debate, but assuming that comes in, Maine is going to be somewhat awash in power, and really challenged to move that into southern New England, where the demand is greatest, of course. Let me go to the next slide, please. So just to get into the siting issue a little bit, again, Maine has got plenty of room, but of course, and I think this is, maybe somewhat true in New Hampshire as well, a lot of the open space and the less densely populated areas are also places with perhaps less transmission infrastructure, and little demand for electricity. So it does raise some challenges, and I think, just globally, when it comes to siting energy of any sort, including solar, or anything else. I often say putting a hot dog stand in this region is hard, right? Nothing comes easily, and there are certainly challenges. But what we're seeing thus far is that the state issues, and to the degree you have wetlands or whatever that might trigger Army Corps, federal jurisdiction. Typically, what we're seeing is mostly not terribly complex or too challenging on average. Although the state DEP, their workload is sort of gone through the roof. Even if it's just stuff that's not super controversial or complex, but still ministerial stuff. Where you're seeing the challenges is at the municipal level, and again, it's not across the board. There are certainly many instances where the municipal permitting is not too big of a deal, but I think on whole, what you see is that that's where the challenge is. In some cases, because municipal ordinances don't really haven't planned for solar, so that's a challenge. Sometimes it's a developer shows up in a community, and the community just doesn't know what to do with you. And we've also seen in some cases where a ordinance was put on the books, but maybe it was sort of put on the books without really anticipating maybe that a project would actually show up. Then a project shows up and they want to rethink the ordinance, or not really sure they meant it the first time. So I expect, particularly given the way the solar, the impacts are very localized, that the municipal permitting will continue to be the biggest hurdle with respect to getting projects cited and permitted. And my assumption is that that's probably a situation that will be analogous in New Hampshire and probably other states in the region. On the policy level, I will note there have been some bills, and there are some bills, in fact, still in the legislative process right now, related to siting for solar, and particularly around agricultural lands and dual use and decommissioning and these sort of issues. I don't know that there's going to be much come of those bills, if I had to guess, right now. I think it's more the beginning of a conversation. Part of the reason I'm not sure much will come of them is because the legislature and the energy policymakers are just frankly overloaded and just not able to dig into a lot of stuff right now. But there's also going to be the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry is going to hold a work group or a process starting this summer to talk about a lot of these issues with a range of stakeholders, including the solar industry, and try to figure out, how to address these issues going forward. So my guess is legislature will allow that to work its way forward before they do any serious policy making. So I'll just sum up by saying I was sort of asked also to address what the sort of public reaction is to Maine to sort of this, really significant amount of solar, a land grab, if you will, is a phrase that was used. My view at this point is that it's mostly kind of under the radar. Again, in municipal level where there's a given project, folks will focus on it. But I think at the big picture, again, because a lot of these, particularly, well, actually all of these projects at this point that I just described, not all, but most of them are still, mostly on the drawing board, and only a few of them are actually on the landscape. I think sort of public opinion has yet to really form in a significant way in a context with a lot of panels on the landscape. So I think public opinion is generally very supportive still for solar and renewable energy generally, but how people will react to a lot more solar actually in operation is a story I think that's yet to be written. So Madeline, why don't I leave it there? I think I've used up my time, and look forward to further questions and dialogue.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Dave. We're going to transition over to our second poll question, which is, What do you perceive as the greatest challenge to build large-scale solar in New Hampshire? First option is policy, lack of state commitment to clean energy, NIMBYism, conservation concerns, lack of available land, associated utility infrastructure, or lack of knowledge and expertise. All right. So not surprisingly, I would say, based on the work that we do at Clean Energy New Hampshire, the biggest barrier is the lack of policy and state commitment to clean energy. But certainly some other conservation concerns, lack of available land or interconnection opportunity, and a little bit of NIMBYism in there as well. So thank you all for your input there. I will hand it over to our next panelist, who is Joe Harrison, who is Vice President of Project Development at Rewild. Over his career, he has successfully developed over 75 commercial solar projects in Massachusetts and Maine, with a focus on large-scale solar project on municipal, landfill, brownfield, agricultural, degraded lands, and the higher education markets. Joe is an expert at navigating permitting, environmental issues, land origination, interconnection, and power purchase agreements. Prior to Rewild and Sunrays, Joe was twice named Project Developer of the Year while at Borrego Solar, which is a top 5 solar energy development and construction firm. Having spent 3 years running the New Hampshire Clean Energy Fund, Joe also has expertise in project finance and energy policy as well. Thanks, and take it away, Joe. We can't hear you.
There we
You
go.
might still be muted.
Thanks, Madeline. On that poll question, it's good to see that all the solar developers here don't think it's a lack of expertise or knowledge that is the issue in New Hampshire. I have to agree. So large-scale solar in New Hampshire, I'm really excited to talk about this, and the two things are kind of parallel tracks for me. I was thinking about how in 2008, I moved to New Hampshire. So I've been here, living here 13 years, and also started my career in solar that same year. So I started out in residential solar and have really enjoyed growing kind of with the New England solar industry, and have, kind of developed projects in the 1 kilowatt residential size all the way up to 10 megawatt distributed generation, community solar projects. And you could go to the next slide. And so I just wanted to frame the discussion a little bit. There's a few different types of solar. There's certainly the residential systems, which tend to connect behind a residential meter and are on a roof or next to a house in the up to 10 kilowatt range is how I think of those. And then there's the commercial or distributed generation systems. That's really where I work, and those are typically up to like 5 megawatts AC. And the key differentiator there is that they tend to participate in some type of net metering, net energy billing type program where oftentimes virtually an off-taker is signing up to purchase the credits or the energy credits from one of these projects. And so the benefit there is a lot of people don't have the right roof space, or businesses don't have space for a big project, but you can put one in a field, and then the energy tends to stay on that distribution grid. It's not going up to the transmission lines and traveling long distance. It's being used locally. And then utility scale is more what we're talking about today, large projects, and they're not so different from your typical old school power plant where you produce the energy, it's connected up to the transmission lines, and it's traveling long distances to where it's needed. And these tend to be in the 10 to 50 megawatt range and up from there. So next slide. And so I couldn't agree more with what Dave was saying about how solar is just naturally limited in certainly states like New Hampshire, where grid infrastructure is a limiting factor. And one limiting factor in solar is kind of your low load conditions, where when people aren't using a lot of energy, but maybe it's a cool sunny day, air conditioning loads aren't on yet, and solar's really cranking. And the issue is overproducing for that local area. And so a lot of substations can only handle a couple of large solar projects. Utility scale solar needs to connect to a transmission line, and typically in the 115 or 34 kilovolt range. And so those would be the red lines on this map. So, you know, you see a lot of white on this map, and really solar can't go in, or utility scale solar just can't go in those areas where there are no transmission lines to connect to. So that automatically eliminates a huge chunk of the state that won't see this type of development. And then there are other natural limiting factors like steep slopes and major wetlands. We recently had vernal pool season, which is a few weeks in the spring, when the peepers are out, and vernal pools can be certified by a wetland scientist. And developers like to joke that, you know, it's the time of year where you lose, you know, 25% of your sites that you had in your pipeline, because things like wetlands and vernal pools are very much protected, and often even have a large buffer associated with them that can wipe out acres and acres of space and render a site just not developable for solar. And then the distributed generation projects, kind of up to 5 megawatts. Right now in New Hampshire, there's a 1 megawatt cap for projects like this. And we'd love to see that increased. And those projects need 3-phase electricity lines, which is even more rare. And a lot of the state, as it gets more rural, you'll just see single-phase, 1-line electricity lines, and you cannot connect a large-scale project to those lines. So lots and lots of limiting factors. Land, you know, available land is not a limiting factor in New Hampshire. And you could go to the next slide. And so this slide, kind of, this concept gets a lot of talk in more advanced solar markets, states with that have had programs and have more solar installed. Certainly, there's some low-hanging fruit like rooftops and landfills and brownfields, in the sense that it's a great use of space, and to some extent parking lots, but the challenge, they each have their own challenge. So rooftop, you know, I believe in rooftop solar, and if your roof is suitable, it probably makes financial sense in any state in New England for the most part. So we definitely should do that, but it's not enough. There was a study in Massachusetts recently that found that 75% of available roofs are not suitable, either because of shade or we see this a lot with newer buildings. They're engineered so well and so tightly that they don't have extra capacity to put a system on the roof. And they're smaller. So, you know, that's a picture of down at Harvard, Gordon Indoor Track Building, a project we did where I just think that that is a massive roof. When I got up there, I was like, wow. And then as we got into design, and you have setbacks from the edge and this and some roof equipment to work around, and just the size that for a big roof like that, it's only 600 kilowatts. And so, you know, like a high school gymnasium might only be 200 or 300 kilowatts. And I think of those as pretty big roofs. And so just to put that in perspective, you know, that's 100 homes powered by solar. We need so much more than that to move the needle. Parking lots, I think it'll happen eventually. It happens out west where people really need shaded parking because of temperatures over 100 so frequently. Parking lots just get so incredibly hot. So they were doing shaded parking anyway. And so to put solar panels on those structures makes a lot of sense. But here in New England, it's 2 or 3 times as expensive. It's a lot more steel. And there's other major challenges to working in parking lots based on landowners and the amount of money they want to make from those projects, and challenges with traffic and plowing and things like that. In landfills, again, in Massachusetts, there's 350 municipal landfills. Most of the ones that are good have solar on them. And that's really because Massachusetts offered an extra incentive, a higher electricity rate, basically, if you put solar on landfills. So to get at these more expensive installs, you really, from a policy perspective, have to incentivize that. The next slide, please. And so, you know, I like to just say that solar requires space. There's no way around it, and it's sometimes one of the biggest challenges where, you know, these systems are pretty spread out, and we, you know, the panels keep getting more efficient, but certainly, you know, you need land to generate large amounts of clean solar energy. But you know, you look at New Hampshire with a population of 1.3 million people, that's pretty small for the amount of land we have. And what do we have? We have 5.9 million acres in New Hampshire. So even if you had all of your electricity come from solar, that's less than 0.5% of all of our land. And we know not all of the electricity would ever end up coming from solar. So, and even some of that would be on roofs and landfills and things like that. So it's, you know, you're going to have some large utility scale projects that look big, certainly, but at a state level, it's a very, very minuscule percentage of our land mass. And so I think some greenfield development is just the only way that you can meet your goals and get there. But I think it's important to keep in mind when you compare solar to other forms of development, it is temporary. We're planting, you know, a meadow environment, which has other ecological value. We have a lot less farmland than we did, and so in some cases it's helpful to add more meadows into the mix. We're planting pollinator grass species, and we're experimenting with dual use and what can we grow under these. And we have a project in Maine where we're going to graze goats or sheep, whichever one doesn't chew the electricity lines, I forget. And so it really is low impact, and we're signing up for decommissioning bonds and robust decommissioning plans where at the end of the project, all of the equipment is removed and the landowner inherits basically a meadow and can let that grow back into forest or whatever they want to do next. So next slide. I'll just quickly hit on interconnection. States like Maine and Massachusetts are kind of at a standstill in terms of being able to go out and just start the development of a new project. And really the reason for that is the substations are full. And so we have some projects in Massachusetts that are involved in a 350 megawatt group study with Eversource. There's a similar study with National Grid, and these are collections of substations that are full where developers have proposed new projects, and with the goal of pooling resources and trying to upgrade, basically rebuild substations with new larger transformers to allow more solar. But really, as soon as that happens, they'll be full again. And in Maine, you know, we kind of haven't figured out how we're going to rebuild substations and pay for those costs. And so those are issues that those states are dealing with. I think there's an opportunity in New Hampshire to get ahead of that issue before we have an influx of lots of projects, because I think that is somewhat inevitable. And so to start planning for how the grid can get upgraded to handle more renewables, more electric cars, things like that, and how do we pay for those upgrades? Those conversations I know are happening and really should continue. And next slide, please. So when we're looking for sites, it really is true that like 95% of our inbound leads are pretty quickly eliminated because they're not near electrical infrastructure, or they have wetlands, or they're too steep, or a number of, or maybe permitting is a challenge in that municipality, or the substation is full. So most sites just don't work, but we try to have a balanced portfolio, and I think a lot of developers do this, where you know you have some land that might be in forestry, but you also have some farmland and some projects on the built environment, so that you have kind of a diverse mix of different sites. And then, you know, we try to be in tune with the state policy goals, and again, states that incentivize brownfields or landfills. We think that might be coming in Maine. So we try to align with those goals and develop responsibly. And then, you know, there are a whole host of permits that you need, especially the larger the project gets, the more you're triggering larger state level permitting processes. But, you know, if you're impacting a wetland, you know, that will trigger often Army Corps of Engineering. You have to go through US Fish and Wildlife, make sure you don't have endangered species on the site. You have to go through the historic preservation folks, and obviously all of your local permits as well. So it's tricky to find a site that can thread the needle and have the interconnection profile you're looking for, and also all of the site characteristics. And my last slide, please. And so just to recap, I think that it's important not to over-regulate land use, because there are just so many natural barriers to solar projects. The biggest one being that we only have an electrical load from our 1.3 million people population, and so it just doesn't take that much solar to meet those demands. And so I don't think we need to over-regulate on the land use side. We've seen some states and have had to kind of work a lot on policy. We've seen some states kind of go down that direction. And then again, planning for, when the markets do open up here and substations and utilities are getting full, figuring out an approach to rate base some of the improvements and how solar projects can cost share, and some of these planning things are really important. And then I think working with the local nonprofits, we see in New Hampshire, there's a handful that are so active and do really important policy work in Concord, and I think just taking the time to talk to them about these land use trade-offs and issues, so that they don't become just automatically anti-solar for environmental reasons. And certainly NIMBYism is here to stay, and is just something we have to work through. And on almost every project, it can be something that you have to work through, but it's worth it in the end. So thank you, and look forward to taking questions at the end.
Thank you, Joe. That was great. We are going to switch over to our third panelist before our break. So I will soon hand it off to Sherry Treffry, who is a New Hampshire native, who is the energy market leader at VHB's Bedford office. She has 17 years of environmental consulting experience managing a diverse group of scientists and engineers that work on land development, transportation, and energy projects, as well as stormwater permit compliance efforts across the state. Sherry specializes in environmental permitting in support of a wide range of energy projects for utility and private developer clients. She is skilled in regulatory consulting, environmental impact evaluation, land use planning, and wetland mitigation. Sherry is a New Hampshire certified soil scientist, a member and former president of the New Hampshire Association of Natural Resource Scientists, a member and former president of the Society of Soil Scientists of Northern New England, and a current member of the board of Clean Energy New Hampshire. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Environmental Conservation and a Master's of Science in Soil Science from the University of New Hampshire. I will hand it over to Sherry.
Thank you. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about siting and permitting solar in New Hampshire. And move on to the next slide. A little bit about VHB. We are about 1,600 people with offices from Maine down to New Hampshire. We're an integrated firm with engineers, scientists, planners, and designers. And we've been working in the solar industry for a long time now, and sort of providing all the services from site due diligence to engineering to permitting to construction oversight. And then probably eventually decommissioning when these projects end up being broken down and taken off the landscape. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about site selection and site control. A lot of that's covered, so we'll kind of breeze through that, and then I'll talk about some of the work that we do on the site, how that translates into how we develop or lay out the arrays on the landscape, and then permitting requirements, and then some things to consider during construction, operation, and decommissioning from a land use perspective. Thank you. So site selection and site control, as you know, what's been talked about, it's really challenging to find these sites. You need the existing electric infrastructure. You have to have capacity on the system to add the generation. You have to have undeveloped land of suitable size and condition. You have to have suitable access. I mean, could be a great parcel, and some of this transmission is like cross country, but there's nothing. It's rural. We live in a rural state. It's hard to get to, and if you can't get the trucks and the equipment and there's no road access, then you can't use that parcel either. And then zoning restrictions, as we talked about earlier, a lot of towns haven't developed ordinances around solar, or if they do, it's not zoned in the zone where you would want to put it. You know, you want to put it in a rural residential area, and maybe solar is only zoned in a commercial industrial area. So especially if you're talking large scale solar development, that can be a challenge. So you're looking at variances and special exceptions. We'll talk about permitting as we move forward. And then site control. You know, you can look at GPS, you can look at your GIS system, and you can have all the other things that we just talked about, but then you have to approach a landowner, you have to see if they're interested, and then negotiation of those agreements. First, you need some access agreement to see if the site is suitable. Then you're negotiating perhaps a long-term lease, or in some cases, you're negotiating the purchase of the property. And all of this is at risk for the developer, and it all takes time. So, you know, many, many months of work go into it before, you know, generally there's like boots on the ground and we're actually doing an investigation. I like what you said about, you know, the vernal pool season making your project like just disappear after you've probably put in 6 months of work, and then you find out that, you know, your site isn't suitable. So those are some of the things to consider when we're on the land. Next slide, please. And then solar on developed sites. I'm not sure why that picture didn't come in there, but that's a parking lot below that with cars there. And so there's some great opportunities with solar on developed land. You know, just what we were talking about, you're delivering power where it's needed at the source. You're not having to generate power and then transmit it long distances, which has cost and loss of electricity as you're transmitting it. Combined use in this picture, you can see, you know, there's these solar panels, and they also have lighting for the parking lot associated with it. So there's some combined use opportunities where you can, you know, generate power. You can also generate light, you know, so that's an opportunity. Your redevelopment of underutilized property. So you're taking something that, you know, doesn't have an existing use. You know, there's a lot of malls out there, and a lot of commercial buildings that have closed in the pandemic. The malls were sort of phasing out, and, you know, now you have a bunch of commercial properties that, you know, the commercial buildings, particularly in New Hampshire, in my neighborhood, where, you know, the businesses have closed. And so there's an opportunity to redevelop those sites with a use instead of those areas being underutilized. So that is an opportunity. Some folks prefer to think of it, you know, when we switched years ago from, you know, lots that had to be 1 or 2 acres in size, and then we started talking about like cluster developments and how we're going to residentially cluster, and we're going to maintain open space because that was better for the environment. Smaller lots, bigger subdivisions with, you know, open space and migratory corridors. You know, that was the trend, and land use development continues to be a trend. So there's a public preference perhaps to have solar in an urbanized environment. Like, hey, it's already developed, it's already, you know, why can't we just put solar here, as we talked about with earlier. And then commercial and industrial zoning. I mean, it's already probably zoned most likely for this use, which I don't know if it fits in commercial or industrial, but it fits that better than it fits rural and residential. So it's appropriately zoned, probably don't need a special exception for it. Challenges, as we were talking about, unsuitable rooftops and parking lots. You know, roofs weren't built, most of the ones in our neighborhood, with the idea that it was going to support or accommodate solar. So you have a lot of, you know, most AC units and all the HVAC system stuff is on the rooftop. So you only have pieces of the roof that can accommodate solar. And then structurally, was it built for that kind of weight? You have to think about the weight of the solar panel plus the weight of the snow, and then, you know, all the things that we associate with New Hampshire winters. So that can be a challenging. Parking lots, same way. There is a structural component to parking lots. You know, just putting down gravel and putting pavement on top of it, you weren't considering putting foundation structures on those soils. you're thinking about the weight of a car. Is that the same? Can that accommodate? And the other consideration too would be, you know, stormwater systems and things. A lot of these old parking lots, you can convert them from brownfields, but they didn't necessarily, maybe they were built before stormwater rules, or they didn't need to have any stormwater system. And now for redeveloping it, you know, what does that mean for the stormwater management of that site? Not that it's contributing anything, but it is an additional thing on a structure, on a parking lot area. Coexistence with existing uses, like we were saying, you know, snow plowing is a big one when you're talking about carports and things like that. One of our biggest challenges when we develop any type of commercial project is that there always is the question is like, where are you going to put the snow when it snows? Where are these big snow piles going to go? And that becomes more challenging. And then just the manipulation of snow around those areas. A way to interconnect with the grid. And then one of the things that I've heard in New Hampshire is that, you know, we're trying to revitalize our downtowns, and we're trying to bring in business, and we're trying to drive economic growth within our Main Street areas. And those are the areas that are zoned commercial, that are zoned industrial, and because you want to attract jobs to those locations. So putting ground mounted solar downtown, where it's an industrial or commercially zoned area, takes away the economic opportunity of having something that attracts jobs. I mean, it's great for the community, it's a tax base, but you're not pulling people into that site. You're not creating jobs. You know, someone goes out and maybe mows it, you know, every once in a while, or checks on the electric system, but you're not generating something that's going to really result in a boom. So, and revitalizing that Main Street. So those are some considerations why there's some opportunities, but there are some real challenges, as others have talked about as well. Next slide, please. So site due diligence. This is the fun part of what we do, right? So I'm a soil scientist. I have worked and managed a bunch of environmental scientists, and this is the fun that we get to do as environmental scientists, is go out and see what we have on site, see where are the wetlands, are there any protected species, are there any endangered species that we have to look out for. We run a report with the Natural Heritage Bureau on these sites, and they send a report back, and it tells us what known occurrences there are for endangered species on the site. Anything within a certain vicinity, we're on the lookout for. And then it could be even on the federal level, whether it's small world pogonia, northern long-eared bat, or, you know, more of the local species, wood turtles, things like that. So we look for those things while we're out there. We do our wetland delineation. In the spring, we do our vernal pool surveys. And then culture resource surveys, which we were talking about, involves like hiring an archaeologist, them going out and doing a phase 1A walkover, and then they have to identify whether there is the potential for an archaeological site or a cultural site. Maybe there's an old farmhouse foundation or a well that indicates there was some early farming activity, or perhaps it looks like a good landscape where there could have been some tribal occupation there. If any of the site is deemed culturally sensitive, then it has to go to a phase 1B cultural survey, where the archaeologists will go out and dig test pits. If they find that there's anything in there that is an artifact, and artifacts, you know, typically could be an arrowhead, could be some stone looking from a, you know, as the folks were taking stones and working them to create tools. Some of that rock flakes and things are considered to be the artifacts and evidence of those, that previous occupation. If they find any of that, then they've confirmed that there is an archaeological site there. And then the next phase from that would be determining the site boundaries and whether that is a significant resource or not. In the state of New Hampshire, we don't have any state recognized tribes. There isn't a ton of activity, being the granite state. We are more of a transit area, but there was some, temporary encampments, and then there was some more long-term occupation in some of our larger river corridors, which also are floodplain areas and flat areas in the state, which lend itself more to solar development. So if you were in one of those areas, you might see a higher incidence of culturally sensitive landscapes and culturally sensitive sites. So that's some of the survey work that would be done there. And then now the alteration of terrain has adjusted their rules to require a wildlife habitat assessment, specifically looking for habitat for endangered species. So that may be required as well if you need an alteration of terrain. So that's some of the work that we do for site due diligence. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I love this photo. This is a photo of some of my coworkers, and they're working on the layout of a solar array. So once we go out and we do all of the existing condition analysis and we put it on a plan, and then we hand it back to the developer and we say, okay, this is the sandbox that you can play in. This is where the wetlands are. These are, if there are any buffers to those wetlands or surface waters, we put those on the plan. We put vernal pools on the plan with whatever buffer that may require. We put cultural sites on the plan, and then you figure it out all with the developer of how, okay, now this is the sandbox, this is where you can play in, this is sort of the safe area. What can you lay out there? Where can you put your road? Where would you need stormwater control if that's required? Where are your conduits going to go? Where's your interconnection route? And how can we lay all these things out to minimize and avoid impacts to the greatest extent possible? Other considerations are maintaining a visual buffer. If you are in an area that is residential or commercial or what have you, where there could be some sensitivity to the aesthetic of the array, is there a possibility to maintain a wooded buffer between the array and the road, perhaps? So those are some of the considerations. We usually go through a few rounds of sort of array layout, and this is the critical piece where the developer is saying, can I get enough power generation to overcome my costs and make a profit and have this project really be viable? So that's this stage, and it's the most critical stage because it's going to dictate how much power they can get, and then what kind of permits are they going to need to do their project. If they have unavoidable impacts, what is that going to mean? And what is this, how long is that going to impact their development timeline? Because time is money, right? So more money spent, more time lost, less generation earlier, so that's the next phase. You can go on to the next slide. So permitting requirements. So there's a long list here. And really, the point here is that there are a lot of there's so much land use regulation for every type of development. Solar is no different than any other type of development. And I would argue that it's better than a lot of types of development. You're not building a big box store with a large, sprawling parking lot. And that's really hard to go from that environment and ever restore that back to something that seems natural. And so the way that we regulate solar should have some considerations for that, but also just recognize that it's not any different than any other land use type that we permit. And I think that can be a challenging concept for some people in the regulatory community who want to kind of sort of think of this as something very different. But in most cases, it's very similar to any other type of work. it's not an occupiable building. So there's some things with regard to building inspectors and local permitting that doesn't necessarily apply here the way that it would apply. We can talk a little bit about that under local permitting, but starting at the top with federal permitting, anything over an acre of land disturbance is going to fall under your National Pollution Discharge Elimination System regulations. That's NPDES. So you're supposed to file, it's a notice of intent that you're going to disturb over an acre of land, and that is filed at the federal level. You prepare a stormwater pollution prevention plan. There are requirements for inspecting the site after a quarter inch of rain or weekly and filing those reports. You have to keep your documentation available for an EPA inspection. You have to keep them, and then when you're finished the project, you have to close out your permit and maintain your documentation for a number of years if in case the EPA ever wants to see it. So there is, I would say that's probably the smallest trigger is the acre. And then Clean Water Act, so if you have any wetland impacts, then you're falling under a federal wetland permit. Endangered, if you fall under a wetlands permit and or if you fall under the NPDES permit, you have to comply with the Endangered Species Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. That's where those triggers for the cultural surveys come in and the endangered species surveys come in. So you have to comply with those. On the state level in New Hampshire is the alteration of terrain permit. That's 100,000 square feet of land disturbance or 50,000 square feet of land disturbance in a shoreland area, 100,000 if you're outside of a shoreland area. So that's a little bit bigger trigger than our NPDES permit. And under that, like I said, you'll have a wildlife habitat assessment, and then the stormwater regulations. That is really a management of a water quality permit. And then a state level wetlands permit in New Hampshire that's combined with the federal 404 permit. But as part of that, you also trigger state protected species oversights. You're looking to coordinate with the Natural Heritage Bureau and the New Hampshire Department of Fish and Game. And then you have vernal pool surveys that need to be done as part of that wetlands permit. And then other jurisdictional areas like prime wetlands, if a town is regulating prime wetlands. Some of those prime wetland areas have buffers of 100 feet that they want you to stay out of. In the shoreland area in New Hampshire, you have ponds greater than 10 acres. Tidal areas and fourth order streams or greater have a 250-foot protected shoreland, and then you would need a shoreland permit for that. So there's those layers of permitting. And then there's the local level, because you're not exempted from that when you're getting your state and your federal permits. So most of these local permits, you're looking at a site plan approval. And as we were talking about the zoning issues earlier, you might be looking at a zoning variance because solar is not a permitted use. It's not even a listed use. And so you might be looking to get a variance or a special exception from the Zoning Board of Adjustment in the local municipality. If they're locally regulating wetlands or shoreland or floodplain, you might be looking at getting a special use permit or a conditional use permit or a special exception for any of those uses that are part of the local zoning ordinance where you're getting permission to build it in that district. So that's a consideration for sure. And then going back to what I was saying about building permits, I was in a municipality, and we were having a meeting with all the local municipal officials, and what I heard was the building inspector saying, well, we can't, how am I going to inspect? I don't have enough inspectors to inspect a large scale solar array. And that sort of struck me as, I think, needing a little bit of education, because we're not building something that's going to be occupied that you're worried about injuring someone. And the real purpose of building inspection is to protect the public. In the case of a solar array, it is to the developer's best interest to make sure that that solar array is functioning properly, because if it's not functioning, it's not making money. So the electrical components of that are the most important part, right? So if there's most of these things are monitored remotely. So if they have any sort of indication on their system that their panels are not functioning properly, then they're going out and taking a look and correcting that problem as quick as they can get out there, because you know, sunlight is money, and if it's not turning into electrons, then it's not working. So I don't think the role of the local municipal official is to do that. The other concern that I heard was I've heard, and some of the developers I work with have heard, is around fire protection, and that the fire department has a real concern about what happens in the case of a fire, how flammable are these things, what are their responsibilities. And you know, there's a reason that these things are fenced, and what I heard one of the developers I work with say is, listen, if this thing catches fire, you just need to stand back, stay outside the fence, and make sure that the fire doesn't spread. Let the thing burn to the ground. It's not occupied. Again, going back to the public safety component, it is not occupied, and there's no one who's going to be at risk. So, you know, with regard to what I was saying, is that it's just like any other development. This is the caveat, that it's not like every other development, and this is the considerations that should be made, that it's not like every other development. So anyway, that's a small speech on that. But I think when we get into a brainstorming session, I think there needs to be, where there's a lot of local opposition, some of that is just real concern of what the role is as a municipal official, and how can we educate them on how to deal with these things. Okay, next slide, please. Aot Stormwater Requirements. I like this photo because it's not pretty. It's sort of the reality of construction. And so I thought it was good to throw this out there. This is not a New Hampshire project, but it is a project that we were on, and there were some stormwater concerns and stormwater issues. And so, you know, my point of using a photo like this is that, you know, this is the construction of something. And if anyone who's been on a construction site, it gets messy. But that just because it gets messy doesn't mean in the end that there is any harm done. As long as there's no discharge, as long as it's contained, as long as, you know, you have the proper sediment erosion controls put in place, then, you know, you have a good project. So you can see that they had some stormwater issues, and they put in some large riprap and some smaller riprap to clean up the sediment, and then they put in a bunch of erosion controls on the slopes to slow things down and minimize the sediment. So real active involvement with this site here. DES has issued some large solar array guidance and revised that in February of 2020. It has some things that are already required for alteration of terrain, just specifying that you need a PE stamp, you need a site-specific soil map that's related to the properties of the soil and the likelihood that it's going to move and erode, and compactability, and, you know, depth of soil and things like that. So as a soil scientist myself, it's our job to go out and tell you what you have and what to expect when you start changing the landscape. An inspection and maintenance plan to have 85% vegetative cover. Again, it's a very standard, that's the same standard under the Stormwater Pollution Prevention and NIPD's regulation, is 85% vegetative cover before its site's considered stabilized, so in line with the federal government. And then the real meat of it has to do with delineating the slopes across the site, whether it's gentle, moderate, steep. So that's like less than 5% is gentle, 8 to 15, or 5 to 8 is moderate, and over 8 is steep slopes. The only problem, and then from there, the stormwater design considerations are related to the slope and the soil hydrologic group, which is just how much the soil hydrologic group is the property that determines how much soil can, how the soil can infiltrate water. So if you have a soil that doesn't infiltrate water very well, then you have a lot of discharge. If you have a soil so that would be like a clay, and then a soil that is like sand that would infiltrate water well. So it can take more stormwater inputs without any discharge, whereas a clay isn't going to take stormwater inputs very quickly, and then it's going to discharge more quickly. So it takes the soil properties, and it takes the slope considerations, and it takes the design of the array, how it's angled on the slope, and it proposes certain sort of design requirements around how you would manage the stormwater. The only problem is that in New Hampshire, we live in a very hilly area. So there's not a lot of area that you're going to find out there that we're going to say isn't, in soils, we do slopes that are less than 3% as an A slope, and then 3 to 8% is a B slope. So even when we're doing our soil mapping, we don't have a breakout for 5%. So that's something that I think should be adjusted if these things go to rules, because that doesn't sort of align with how our soil mapping is done. But a lot of the territory in New Hampshire is going to be either a moderate slope or it's going to be a steep slope, because we just live in a hilly part of the country. So a lot of these are if you're on a steep slope, then you have to consider the panel's impervious is the take-home message. And then you have to design a stormwater management system around considering that all to be impervious. And that can be, depending on the size of the array, that could be a lot. And we've built a lot of solar with developers. VHB has, and we haven't really seen a lot of erosion control issues or problems with rills and things like that once the project is built and the area is stabilized with dense vegetation. We haven't really seen that. So, there are problems in construction, and we could talk a little bit about how to address those. But, and then sediment erosion controls during operation, benching on steep slopes, and certain things that AOT is considering, which again could add to the cost of the development and make it a non-viable project. Next slide, please. So construction considerations, this is what I was talking about. So this site looks much better, right? They're rolling out some matting, erosion control matting here. It's a little bit of a slope, not too bad. And you can see that, they have some vegetation that's still sort of growing in around the site. And then where there's been disturbance, they're rolling out this erosion control. So this is a much happier photo of construction. But one of the things that we find this with all types of development, not just solar development, is construction phasing is really important. It's really important to plan and think about it. If you go out and you take the trees down and you scrape up every piece of vegetation at once, and it's a big site, and then you get a big storm, where is everything going? I mean, now you've just created a big mud puddle out on your site, and then the workers are like, well, we can't get out here, and the trucks are getting stuck, and why, and it has to do with the way that, land development normally goes. You hire the tree contractor, and then you hire the excavator, and then, eventually the guys that are going to come and put the panels in come in, and it's like, it's different crews and it's different things. But the problem is that when you open up a lot of land, you get a lot of soil movement. And so, really planning your erosion controls, making sure that they are in place, making sure that your stormwater BMPs, if you're designing a sediment basin, if you're designing swales, make sure that those things are installed first and they're ready. And so whatever your operational stormwater management infrastructure is going to be, make sure that those are in place. Like do those first, and then go and open up the site, because it does, again, it takes things a little bit out of order, and it could add a little bit of cost, but the pain on the back end of having a site that's unworkable, or you're in trouble with, the local, conservation commission comes out and takes a look at it and says, oh my God, this is a disaster, DES is calling you. It's just better to try to plan it in advance, get your stormwater BMPs in place. Don't open up the entire site, open up a portion of the site, get that constructed and stabilized. If you have the ability to do that, that's highly recommended, and it'll save a lot of heartache. And then construction monitoring, more and more common with alteration of terrain, asking for, as a condition of the permit, asking for a wetland scientist or other qualified person to weekly inspect the sites and provide reports back to DES. So that's another reason you don't want a report that looks like a giant mud puddle and send that back to DES, and then they start asking questions. So having someone who's qualified on site, working with the contractors, going over the concerns, making sure that if there are any time of year restrictions with regard to migratory bird nesting or northern long-eared bat, making sure that we're not going out and clearing the site in any of those sensitive seasons. All very important. Next slide, please. Solar fields built to benefit. Maintenance considerations, we, just as we were saying, there's some innovative things, using sheep, using, pollinators, like flowering species to benefit pollinators. We've done a lot at VHB with working with developers on developing a pollinator, a beneficial pollinator program in these solar development projects. And it's become more of the norm. It's just what you do. It's good for the environment. It's an easier maintenance schedule. So those are all things to consider. Wildlife friendly fencing. If the point is to keep the deer out, not that you can keep deer out with a good fence anyway, but or keep people out, you can have fencing that starts maybe 8 inches above the ground, so turtles can get through, other snakes can get through, whatever low height animal that you can have that and still maintain that corridor. We've seen black racer snakes actually like go up and over fences because they're climbers. So there is some wildlife fencing considerations that you can have to have that still be in an area that wildlife can use. And then maintenance of your stormwater BMPs. It's all great to design a good stormwater system, but stormwater systems are designed to collect sediment, and they do collect sediment over time. And if you don't clean them out, then they become useless and they're not really doing their job. So as part of maintaining the solar field, they also need to maintain these BMPs, these stormwater maintenance practices, so that they can properly function. Next slide, please. And then decommissioning. As was talked about, this is becoming a norm of these decommissioning bonds and agreements, and that after the 20-25 year lifespan, then these panels will be removed. This is unique to this industry. This is a temporary development, unlike your box store and your parking lot. And so as part of those agreements, they'll remove their equipment. They could remove the stormwater BMPs and or repurpose them for a future development, and then restoration of that ground. With soil considerations, we've seen in Vermont where they've identified prime ag soils and want you to remove prime ag soils, stockpile them, and then sort of put them back when you're done. Once you remove, it remains to be seen how effective that's going to be, because soil is a living, breathing element. It's a large biomass, it's fungus, it's bacteria, and changing that environment and then trying to put it back. I mean, its whole ecosystem is going to be different than it was when it was sort of in situ. So I'm not sure exactly how that is going to play out in the long run. But there's lots of things. I mean, sites are restored all the time. So it's just a matter of, going back in, making sure that you have enough organic material, you have the right amount of nutrients, and you're applying the right seed, and you have enough water. I mean, it's pretty simple. The compaction issue is one that gets is talked a lot about, because you're bringing machines in there, and if you're compacting the soil to a greater extent, does it really ever go back? And I think there's a lot of things that can be done to address that issue, but that is one that does get talked about quite a bit, but it's one that can be addressed. And then, it'll be suitable for any other sort of redevelopment. I think that's all my slides, so thank you for listening.
Great, thank you so much, Sherry. So as we had mentioned, we're going to give everybody a 5-minute break since this is kind of a long event. So it's 10:21 right now, so we will come back at 10:26 to go on with our next panelist. So enjoy your little break. All right, welcome back, everyone. It is 10:26 and it's the end of our break. So we will start with our third poll question, which is a little bit of trivia. How many megawatts of solar are in the ISO New England generator interconnection queue? Select one. I believe these are in megawatts of capacity. Anywhere from 590 to 964. All right, the leading answer is 964.7, though there is pretty good distribution all over. The actual correct answer is 703.55. So though there is certainly a lot, and as most of you are probably aware, not every single thing in the queue ends up getting built. There's a lot of prospecting, but that is a lot of solar in the pipeline. I will now hand it off to our fourth panelist, who is Emily Cole. Emily leads the American Farmland Trust Climate and Agriculture Program in New England. She works both to improve and advocate for the integration of climate smart management practices into New England's productive farming communities through education, outreach, and policy. Before joining AFT, Emily was an assistant professor of environmental science at Westfield State University. She earned her doctorate in plant and soil science from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where her research focused on improving soil health and carbon sequestration through the application of biochar and implementation of climate smart management practices. She also holds a Master's of Science education from Boston University and a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from Kenyon College. Thanks for being with us, Emily.
Thank you, Madeline. So good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining this event today. I would like to share a little bit about American Farmland Trust role and why we're in this conversation around solar siting, particularly on farmland. As Madeline mentioned, I'm a soil scientist, just like Sherry. My work here at AFT over the last 2 years has been partially soil health focused, but about 50% of my time has actually been working on a regional partnership project with Acadia Center, Conservation Law Foundation, Vote Solar, and Vermont Law School around smart solar siting and looking to find ways to reduce conflicts over siting by reaching agreement amongst multi-stakeholder groups on policies, principles, and programs. And that has really, I would say, opened American Farmland Trust eyes into the role that farmland has in siting solar and advancing clean energy goals. However, our main goal at American Farmland Trust is to protect farmland. We want to make sure that farmers can also stay on that farmland and that we're integrating the best practices as well. And just last year, we released this Farms Under Threat, the State of the States report. And it looked at the high value levels of farmland in each state, which are the darker green spots on the map. And you can see that New Hampshire doesn't have a lot of the highest degree of productive, resilient farmland. But what it has is very important to the state. And what you can also see here is some red, which is land that has been developed for either urban and high density land uses or low residential development. And New Hampshire has lost 12,000 acres between 2001 and 2016 of just farmland. And you can see on the slide here sort of where it ranks with some of the other Northeast states. And New Hampshire's farmland is particularly valuable because of really the small amount of really nice flat cropland because you are a very mountainous state. Next slide, please. The big piece of this Farms Under Threat report was to also look at policy responses. And New Hampshire's threat in terms of the Northeast is the bottom half, and the policy response is sort of in the middle as well. The things that this report looked at include purchase of ag conservation easement programs, land use, property tax relief programs, agricultural districts, farm link programs, and state leasing. And there's a lot of room for improvement. And one way that we identified that many states in New England can improve some farmland protection is really utilizing solar as an additional opportunity to actually protect farmland. And so with that appropriate policy support, we see a lot of promise in farmland protection moving forward. Next slide. What we have seen under this evaluation is that there's a real significant loss of the middle income, the middle producing farms, and a shrinking of the smaller producing farms as well, and a large consolidation of the big farms that are producing most of the products in the agricultural economy. And this is true. This is a US-wide snapshot. But if you look on the food in the path of development image, you'll see that these are the 4 sectors of the ag economy that are the most impacted by farmland loss and development. And this looks a lot like New Hampshire's agricultural economy. And so this is particularly impactful when we think about what New Hampshire produces. Tons of milk, tons of dairy, lots of trees, whether it is apple trees, but also Christmas trees, and some of these production regions in agriculture are near and dear to New Hampshire, and they're some of the most threatened. Next slide. This is a snapshot of the New England Food Vision. And if you're not familiar with it, there's a link at the bottom that you're welcome to nab and follow. But this is looking at how do we produce 50% of New England's food locally by 2060. And the main takeaway here that I want to focus on is that we actually need about 3 times as much farmland in New England as we currently have. And so we are losing farmland day by day across New England, New Hampshire included. Yet to be a more local and sustainable food economy in the region, we need to be gaining farmland. And we need to gain farmland for increasing grass-fed animal products and an increase in ground crops, vegetable production, nuts, grains, and fruits. And so in order to do this, it's tricky. We have to not only stop permanent development, but we have to identify places where we can expand productive farmland. And so we're looking for about 4 million acres of new farmland across the region. And that's tough when we're losing thousands and thousands of acres annually. Next slide. So that really is why AFT is in the conversation. It might seem a little odd or unusual to have a farmland protection organization be at the table, but it's really important to us because we support accelerated solar development. We believe that with proper planning and siting, that our agricultural lands can play a meaningful role in hosting solar energy. We think it can also happen while maintaining active and productive agriculture. Climate change is coming for all of us regardless, no matter what land you sit on. And so if we can advance solar energy, advance our clean energy goals to mitigate climate impacts, we can also find solutions that can site that solar where it doesn't displace active agriculture or it integrates into active agriculture. And that's really where AFT, that's the place where AFT is coming from and where we're trying to move the conversation forward. We know that it's not feasible, even though there's a technical potential, we know it's not feasible to site solar only on rooftops, on developed lands, on contaminated lands. As part of our New England Smart Solar Siting Partnership project, we looked at that. Farmland will be on solar will be sited on farmland. There will be lots of ground mounted solar, we need it. So if we can be in the conversation early around how do we site it on farmland? What are the best places? What are the best types of farmland to site it? How might we integrate it into active farmland? You know, if we're in this conversation from the get-go, we think that there are going to be greater opportunities to use solar development. And actually, development for us isn't quite the right word, because AFT thinks that when it's well done that it's not a development. It's not a full conversion of farmland. It is an integration. And so if this is done well from the get-go, we think that we can integrate it, and not to be corny here, but you know, we can harvest more than just the sun, and we can harvest more than just the crop, but on the same acre of land, we can harvest both. And so we're really working to maximize potential renewable energy and minimize impact on our productive farmland. And we think that this can happen moving forward with smart siting. Next page. So working internally and with partners, we've developed some solar siting guidelines for farmland that can help shepherd solar to where it will be least impactful or where it can be best integrated. And three guiding principles are really in the development here are to prioritize farmland. And so if we can guide siting to disturbed or to marginal farmland first, then that is going to be ideal and keep our most productive farmland fully productive. But secondly, prioritize agriculture. You know, if we can protect farmland for the future by siting solar as dual use, and I'll get into a little more about dual use in just a moment. But the quick snapshot here is basically what you see in this image is spaced out raised panels where tractors and machinery can continue to access the land. And there's very little land that is no longer in development, really just the very small band right in the post row. So if we can protect farmland from for the future by siting as dual use, then that's the win-win. And also prioritize farmers. If we are going to be asking farmers to use farmland, their land that perhaps has been in their families for generations, to site solar, we should include farmers in discussions around development and design of solar projects. Next slide. So let me get into a little bit about dual use, because this is really where AFT sees the most promise. We think that well-sited dual use, well-designed dual use that can protect farmland from conversion, it can support farm viability, it can increase the adoption of soil and water conservation best management practices, and it can advance solar energy all simultaneously. And when done in a manner that meets high standards that AFT is really pushing, it's not a conversion of farmland. It's not a loss. It's not a development of farmland. It is continued in production. It's continued to be able to implement climate smart practices, engage in practices that will mitigate climate change on top of clean energy production. And so this is where I'm going to spend the next few minutes explaining what this looks like in general, but also what are some of the best management practices and designs that could be used in New Hampshire to try to protect farmland while simultaneously moving solar forward. And so dual use is also called agrivoltaics, sometimes also called co-location. And there are also a wide variety of definitions of what this actually means. It varies state by state. We're heavily involved in the Massachusetts SMART program around dual use, and that's the frame of reference that we use most often because they have really good design standards for dual use. And so if we're installing solar panels on farmland that is going to also support agricultural activity simultaneously, then it needs to be designed in a manner that's not exactly the same as traditional ground mount solar. Next slide, please. So how's it different? There are three main pieces here that we consider around ensuring that a dual use project is really well designed, and that is the compatibility of the structure with the production system, methods of construction, and then the overall design of where the panels are located, the infrastructure, the posts, the height, the spacing. Next. So here you can see this is a real dual use project that's in Munson, Massachusetts by Sunbug Solar. And what we see here are panels that are raised off the ground. The leading edge has to be at least 8 feet off the ground. And so when it's planted, it's minimum 8. When it's flat, it's upwards of 10 feet off the ground. The spacing here is 20 feet between posts. It's a tracking system, and these panels are bifacial. And so we're seeing, more and more panels like this where you're actually getting the reflectance off the ground as well. And it really can take advantage because even if you have crops growing underneath, crops don't need all of the sunlight that hits them. And there's a lot of reflectance back. And so this particular raised panel and increased spacing provides opportunity for quite a number of agricultural activities. If the spacing is wide enough for your tractor, then you can continue to harvest mechanically, plant mechanically. You can really access 90% of the field that you could have accessed before. You can also have livestock that are grazing in a pasture that has these raised and spaced panels. And that is probably the agricultural activity that is most recognized, sort of most well understood, that is very, very compatible with solar. At this height, you can have dairy cattle. You can have, beef cattle here. The spacing is large enough where they have sunshine, the grass below, the forage below is getting enough sunlight to produce good biomass, but also you're providing shade in some of the hottest times of the summer to these animals. And that can actually improve their internal temperatures, increase their well-being. So it's not just that it can work together, but there's actually a benefit to grazing around solar panels for these animals. Next slide. During construction, there are a lot of best management practices, and I'm not the construction expert. I'm really more of a soil ecologist, and so I'm thinking about what are the BMPs that can really help maintain that soil. And as Sherry said, it's a living thing. It's an ecosystem by itself. So the more that you can protect that soil, then the better off and then the more productive that land will continue to be. And so when you're siting dual use, it's important that you maintain all topsoil in place on site and really disturb as little as possible. Avoid grading at all costs. Maintain ground cover. There are a lot of low growing cover crops and seeds and various plant mixes that you can grow that will not inhibit construction. And in terms of the infrastructure, using driven piles and helical posts disturbs very little. If you're using concrete footings and laying down gravel, you're disturbing. With concrete footings, you're losing a lot more square footage, and it's more destructive to remove. And if you're laying down gravel, then you've lost access to that land for production. And if you're using driven piles and helical posts, the machinery can be a lot smaller, and you can work with the farmer to access the field when it's drier, to limit damage, to limit compaction. And if there are construction impacts, then part of the construction process, as you're completing it, should be to try and remediate any of those impacts that you can. If it's loss of ground cover, then it's perhaps reseeding. If it is compaction, that's a little more difficult to remedy, but there are ways that you can work with a farmer to try to improve compaction. Next slide, please. Last is compatibility, and this is just sort of an overall set of concepts that we look at to try to think about well-designed dual use. And that's thinking about agriculture in the long term. A farmer that owns this land maybe it's a dairy right now, and they've got 200 head of dairy cattle that they have on site, and they're rotating and they're grazing, and so that's really easy to integrate solar into that type of system. But when that farmer retires and passes on to the next generation, it may not continue to be a dairy. And so thinking about the design and structure of the overall solar array is important to think about compatibility with more than just what the current use is. So trying to limit shading that's over, say, 50% of any square foot over any portion of the day on average is a great way as sort of a minimum standard to ensure that other types of systems can grow there. It can be crops, it can be vegetables, beyond just grazing. The other thing to think about is working with the farmer and making sure that they have what they need to adapt to the new structures on site. In Massachusetts, they receive an adder. Any solar developers, it's a 6-cent adder per kilowatt hour with its dual use. There is an added cost to building these structures, and so we are seeing that this is enough incentive to move it this way and to get more dual use. But part of that 6-cent adder is going towards these developers supporting the farmers in transitioning and adapting to farming around the solar panels. And also to work with them in ensuring that they have a farm plan that can go forward and a backup farm plan if that doesn't work, because this is relatively new. We've only had dual use. The first dual use was at UMass in 2011, a very small project, and it's still under research projects right now, but it's still relatively new to understand all of the ins and outs and which types of plants are most compatible, which types of systems are most compatible. The last piece is 25 years after, say, whenever the lease is due to end, working with the farmer to make sure that that farmland can be returned to production as quickly as possible. So decommissioning and basically working with best management practices and decommissioning just like you would with construction, trying to limit impacts to those soils as much as possible. Next slide, please. The last couple of slides, I'm going to back up a little bit from just dual use and think about how we can maximize benefits of solar on farmland, no matter the type of solar that you have. In this image, it's another type of dual use where you have a raised panel and lots of spaces, but these particular points are beneficial no matter the height of the panels, no matter the spacing of the rows. Implementing regenerative practices on site, including cover crops and planting species that can actually sequester carbon. They can improve moisture retention in times of drought, improve infiltration in heavy rain events, all of which can help manage stormwater. Even if it is regular ground mount, integration of smaller livestock like sheep is a wonderful way to both manage the vegetation on site and support agriculture in another manner. There's quite a lot of this work happening. There is just really wonderful reports about the impacts that this can have, the co-grazing of sheep and solar panels. There's also some ecological and landscape level land use planning that could really benefit solar no matter what type it is on the ground. As Sherry mentioned, integrating wildlife mobility and migration into design. Creating wildlife habitat on site. So perhaps you have native pollinator planting simply as a border around the site, or you could have it completely integrated into the actual plant biomass, the plant mix that's growing. You're also increasing site biodiversity through microclimates if you're thinking around what you're planting, if it's traditional or if it's grazing. You have regions of high shade and regions of high sun. You are supporting really the insect biodiversity here with offering both of those. And then lastly, it's an opportunity to restore environmentally degraded areas. You can have really tired farmland that is marginal. It has lost its production ability. It has really suffered from, let's say 100 years of continuous use. Or you have areas where there's been topsoil loss. It's an opportunity to get in here, put the solar panel, the solar array up, and then think about management practices that can improve that soil. You can improve the site soil, you can improve the biodiversity without any impact on the solar design, and you are increasing the climate change mitigation impact of that site simultaneously. Go ahead, so the next slide. The overall benefits for farmers and farmland here, the potential is huge. Again, AFT believes that if this is well designed, this protects farmland from that permanent development, whether it's low density residential or whether it's urban and high density development. You lose the ground that you harvest from when it is developed like that. If you have solar that is integrated really well, you do not lose the ground. You still have the soil, and you still have the ability to produce. You still have those increased climate impacts that can be gained on site. But this also protects that land for the next generation of farmers. It protects the land for new farmers trying to find that 2 acres to get their start on. New England farmland is incredibly expensive. Rhode Island and Connecticut are the most expensive in the country, but New England as a region, incredibly expensive. So it's very difficult for new farmers to find land. If we have solar that is protecting that land, we're protecting access. And secondly, when we're leasing, when there's a lease situation, that farmer is receiving income that diversifies but is also stable. And that extra income can allow the farmer to then try new production systems, improve their climate smart agricultural practices, because it's steady, it's stable, it's dependable. And we know that year to year production can really fluctuate depending on the climate, which itself is fluctuating even worse. So this is an opportunity really to provide support for our agricultural economy, to advance solar energy. And together, it's really a 1 + 1 = 3 situation in terms of climate impact. If we are constructing it well, managing it well, and using climate smart practices to maintain and produce agriculture on site. Next slide, I think it's my left. So there's a couple of sites here that have a lot of information that we've aggregated around our work in the partnership project that I mentioned and around smart solar siting that I encourage you to take a look at. But with that, I'm done.
Great, thank you so much, Emily. And we will now transition over to our last panelist before we move into our Q&A and discussion. So our last panelist is Audrey Fredrickson, who is land use and environmental advocacy attorney at Scenic Hudson. Scenic Hudson is a nonprofit organization based in Poughkeepsie, New York, dedicated to preserving the scenic, ecological, recreational, historic, and agricultural treasures of the Hudson River Valley. Scenic Hudson strongly supports the goals of the 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which increased New York's 2030 renewable energy supply target from 50% to 70% in the interest of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and mitigating the worst impacts of climate change. Audrey's work focuses on renewable energy siting issues in the interest of making the Hudson Valley a model for the transition to clean energy. Take it away, Audrey.
Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I am located in Beacon, New York, and I live right on Main Street. We've been working from home for months, so hopefully the truck traffic isn't too loud. So next slide, please. We'll jump right in the interest of trying to get through this and get to some Q&A and some brainstorming. So as mentioned, Scenic Hudson, we are in New York, so I think my goal here today, I think we've heard about a little bit of the experience in Maine and Massachusetts, so I will bring a little bit of the story of what is going on in New York and what Scenic Hudson, as both a land trust and an advocacy organization, is doing with regard to renewable energy and some of the targets and goals that we have here in New York. Our mission is to preserve land, we preserve farms, we work often with AFT, and our main focus is the Hudson River Valley, and so we are looking to both protect and fight threats. Next slide, please. I think you can hit the button one more time for whatever reason. There we go. So just very quickly, so everybody understands very briefly a quick snapshot of what we have going on in New York. One of the things that was mentioned, it was interesting to me that the answer to the first poll question is the lack of sort of a state policy or overriding target in New Hampshire. We have quite a different situation here in New York, and the history is we had a 50% renewable energy standard back in 2015. As Madeline mentioned when describing my work, we have now increased that by statute. So this is a legislative act now where we have a goal to have 70% of our energy come from renewable sources by 2030 and 100% from clean sources by 2040. I think that nuclear is the difference in there and the point of some debate. But we also have codified in law, at least with regard to distributed solar, which Joe described to us, a target of 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar. And then, you know, to achieve the 70% target, we also are going to have to build some large-scale land-based wind and solar. And one of the differences, again, in New York, we also have some offshore wind opportunities, maybe a little bit greater than you do in New Hampshire. We had subsequent law put in place last year as part of our state budget process, where we are going to address some of the issues. And we heard about how interconnection is an issue in Maine and perhaps in New Hampshire. So New York is undertaking a grid study to try and figure out what upgrades are necessary. With regard to finding those opportunity areas, the state is undertaking like a build ready program where a state agency called NYSERDA, it's the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, they are looking for previously developed or contaminated areas to actually develop and flip to developers themselves. We have a new office, permitting office, the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, that was created by this statute that is going to address utility scale renewable energy projects in particular. And here in New York, that means 25 megawatts and above. And then in terms of, you know, trying to address some of the NIMBY issues that we also experience in New York, there's a requirement in the statute that these projects provide community benefit. And for the most part, that it comes in the form of a bill reduction. And just in terms of the mechanism of how we are trying to get this done in New York, NYSERDA, that authority I mentioned, does both sort of a smaller scale incentive pricing mechanism, and that is called the New York Sun program. And then there are also yearly solicitations for large scale renewables. And NYSERDA acts as sort of the broker for purchasing and also selling renewable energy credits between developers and the utilities, who are the organizations, the load serving entities, who are actually obliged to obtain more and more of their energy supply from renewable sources. So what it is doing is creating a market for renewable energy in New York State, and that's where we come in. So next slide, please. I really took away some great points from our speakers earlier today. I've been scribbling madly and learning a lot. So, you know, Dave mentioned, you know, one of the main takeaways is that it's a challenge for developers to try and get solar built when communities haven't really envisioned or planned for solar, right? And Joe also mentioned that better sited projects, they get approvals more easily, which means we help meet renewable energy goals more quickly. So, you know, all sort of logical things here. Sherry mentioned that sometimes zoning or local ordinances creates barriers to permitting for solar. And then Emily mentioned, you know, with regard to agricultural resources in the ag economy in particular, that AFT sees solar as an opportunity to protect farmland, right? But we need to have appropriate policy in place. How do we align our renewable energy policy with our agricultural policy? And these are all things that Sam Hudson, you know, with the sort of advent of this large renewable energy target and a big movement on the part of the state that is incentivizing the development, questions that we also noticed and are looking for answers to, and then trying to create our own internal strategy to deal with it in the context of our conservation work, but then also create tools for stakeholders and decision makers to then implement their own policy, sort of in the vision of the way we see things. So a couple of quick points. So at Scenic Hudson, as I mentioned, we are both a land trust and an advocacy organization. We go through sort of a strategic planning process, right, as climate change has emerged for both land trusts and other environmental and other organizations, and our government as a big issue that we need to address, we started to integrate into that our internal organizational strategic plan, right? And in terms of that, we are interested in strengthening resiliency, and as Madeline mentioned in the intro, right, our goal is to make the Hudson Valley in particular, which is our sort of service area, into a model for responding to climate change. And so related to that, we have developed a vision for the Hudson Valley as a model. And what we are interested in doing is helping to make a shift to a region powered by renewable energy, right? We recognize that that needs to be a rapid transition, but along the same lines as Emily mentioned, you know, in terms of protecting agricultural land, which is one of the things we protect, you know, we are interested in getting renewable energy sited and developed and doing that on an accelerated and rapid basis, but also in a way that protects all of the things that we've been working so hard for the last 50 years as an organization to protect, right? Our scenic, historic, agricultural, environmental, and our economic resources, because to a large extent, you know, the economy of the Hudson Valley depends on these natural resources and our view sheds and our farms. So that's sort of, you know, the thinking of our organization as a land trust and an advocacy group, and where we are going and what our goal is. Next. Thank you. And so Emily mentioned this as well, right? The idea of landscape level planning. And this ties into, I think, Dave and Joe's comments, right? Better sited projects and getting some planning ahead of the curve in place is really critical to being able to achieve our renewable energy targets, right? So trying to find low impact and low conflict sites, making sure in that planning process there are opportunities for public and community input, right? Transparency and making people feel and getting people a seat at the table goes a long way towards reducing conflicts and getting buy-in. And then, you know, in terms of our strategy and our vision, we are interested in getting information in the hands of stakeholders to help direct development to appropriate locations, right? And that increases the chance of meeting energy targets. And then in terms of land trusts in particular, right, as organizations that have already, you know, most likely done some strategic conservation planning, they have sort of, you know, if you think of it as two sides of a coin, right, if they are already identifying lands that are important for protection due to their conservation value, whether it's scenic or natural resources or habitat or agricultural, those land trusts can offer critical input in trying to identify the least conflict sites, because on the other side of the coin, so long as they are near interconnection opportunities, we can maybe find those least conflict sites. So those are, you know, sort of the parameters and the framework and the thinking behind some of the work that we are doing in Scenic Hudson that I'll describe next. So next slide, please. So what we have done at Scenic Hudson, and we, as I mentioned, we have, you know, a land trust and we are an advocacy organization. So we are very lucky to have quite a large staff. We have conservation scientists on our staff. We have several attorneys. We have a very large land acquisition group and folks who are well versed in the resources that we have in the Hudson Valley that we are interested in protecting. We have GIS professionals. We have mapping capability. So we are really lucky to have all of these things, but that also puts us in a position where we can create some tools and resources for others to either use or use as a model and even replicate in other portions of New York State or even beyond. And so I'm really happy to be speaking with folks in New Hampshire today and describe to you what we've done, and hopefully this can provide a model or stoke some thinking, and we can show you what can be done beyond New York. So we have created what we are calling our How to Solar Now toolkit. At this point, it has 3 parts. One is a guide to siting renewable energy in the Hudson Valley. It's literally a published list of principles for siting, much in the way that Emily described principles for siting on ag lands in particular. This is a more broad set of siting principles. And then with regard to the local ordinance issue, in New York, we are a home rule state. That means every one of the 1,600 municipalities in New York has the authority to adopt their own local comprehensive plan and zoning laws. And if we are, going to get at least those smaller, rooftop, commercial and industrial solar and community solar projects of less than 25 megawatts in size built in the right place, we need to have local laws in place that promote that. And then last but not least, the sort of crown, jewel in our crown is our recently released solar mapping tool, which is a GIS-based web tool that folks can use to overlay various data layers and help to find those best places for solar. So I'll describe each of those in turn. Next slide, please. So these are just the cover pages of the siting guide and the zoning guide. They are both available online at our How to Solar Now website. And can you, if you can't sleep at night or need something to do, you can go ahead and take a look at those. Next slide. So just very quickly, next slide, please. So this is the Clean Energy Green Communities Guide. And you've heard this phrase already today, right? The smart from the start approach, trying to avoid conflicts at the outset and to streamline review and approvals, as Jill mentioned. So the principles are, we want to, first of all, adopt some clear principles and find the low-hanging fruit first, prioritize redevelopment and co-location. But we recognize and understand, as we've heard today, that just putting it on rooftops is not going to meet the world's energy needs, right? We certainly need a lot of energy, especially when we turn on the air conditioners. So finding those places where we are avoiding impacts to visual, natural, and agricultural resources is important. Reducing conflicts will streamline permitting. And so, the interest here is to try and help renewable energy goals. Next slide. And then very quickly, the How to Solar Now guide, and I haven't done some research as to how directly applicable it might be in New Hampshire as local codes may or may not be adopted. But this is a step-by-step guide, but sort of as an overview, you can see this is all in line with our vision for the Hudson Valley at least, and provides some best practices and recommendations for when you sit down and you look at your existing code or decide, that the one you have in place maybe isn't that good in actual practice, or that you need to develop a whole new one. There's sort of a step-by-step approach here, right? And the first one is we are encouraging municipalities to not be obstructionist, but to be pro-solar, right? Take a look at what you already have on the books and make sure that you don't have barriers. As Sherry mentioned, sometimes zoning that is in place, might say, oh, solar only is permitted in the commercial and industrial zone. That doesn't really make sense, because now you're competing with commercial and industrial uses, right? That can bring in the tax vehicles and the kind of use that you want. So make sure you're eliminating barriers. Define what we're talking about clearly. You know, Joe described to us all of the different kinds of solar that is out there. One of the difficulties is that it is so scalable, right? It can be a very small rooftop project all the way up to a 350 megawatt ground-mounted utility scale solar project. So, you know, finding the correct way to define what is coming down the pike is very important. And so that in that regard, you need to know what the market is and what you can expect. And then, you know, that landscape planning, and that's where our solar mapping tool comes in. And when it comes to regulating, we recommend, right, don't over-regulate. I think we heard this from Joe. You know, if it is a smaller project, it doesn't need, you know, a special use permit and some hugely complex and convoluted permitting process, right? So know the market, know what kind of projects are coming, be aware of what the impacts may be, and then set the permitting process appropriately. And then we address some of the more difficult issues, you know, that may or may not result in the NIMBYism we see, which is what are the visual impacts of these projects? How do we achieve the alignment of agricultural interests as well as our solar interests, which Emily just spoke about so wonderfully? Try and find a way to permit these things broadly, and, you know, as I think was mentioned earlier, what the idea here is behind what developers are doing is they need to create and design a project that generates enough power to overcome their costs, you know, and make a project viable, right? So if you are creating zoning that's overly restrictive, will impact the developer's ability to do that and start to impact, you know, not only your interest in getting clean energy built in your community, but impacting broader renewable energy goals. And then plan for the future, decommissioning, which we've heard about quite a bit today. And then there's also the idea of sort of being solar ready. You can write codes, you know, all the way up to a requirement that any new construction have solar on the roof or provide for solar. So that's a sort of overview of what we're, you know, thinking about in terms of recommendations for zoning. And so then very quickly, if we go to the next slide, I'll try and get through the description of our solar mapping tool. Next slide, please. And if you hit it a few more times, I think we can get the 3 use cases. There you go. And so we created, as I mentioned, and I'll show a snapshot in a second, we created a mapping tool, right? And so it is a combination of guidance, actual written guidance that addresses, first of all, how to use the tool, but secondly, how to think about natural resources that are on the map in GIS information and how it relates to solar. And so hopefully this mapping system can do a few things. It can support comprehensive planning and zoning because you can visualize on a map in your particular area of interest the resources that are important for solar. You can even narrow it down to a particular site and look at its potential for solar development. And then, you know, sort of zooming back out, if you look at your community as a whole, you might be able to use it to try and, you know, even sketch out the amount of acreage and potential areas that are available for solar and start to set something like even a megawatt renewable energy goal for your community and tie that into something like a climate action plan. So we'll just go through these next set of slides very quickly. So our tool has 4 parts. The first one sort of does what Joe did for us today, which is, you know, describes what on-earth solar is to help try and do some of that myth busting that we heard about today. Part 2 describes our approach to smart solar planning, which is a 4-step process. I'll talk about that in a second. Part 3 educates the user about all of the various GIS layers that are provided in the tool. And that's everything from ag soils to wetlands to distribution lines to rooftops. And then part 4 is when you can actually get your hands on the tool and start turning the layers on and off and zooming in and zooming out and seeing what the actual situation on the ground looks like. So next slide. Right, so our approach to solar planning is one, take a look at what your area of interest looks like already. Find those opportunity areas, right, where the rooftops, where the landfills, all of these things are, we found data sets from all over that we then streamed into the tool. Then we, described the valued resources that we would want to avoid, from core forests to wetlands to prime agricultural soils. And then lastly, evaluating solar feasibility. Now, this might be the opposite direction from which developers approach the kind of siting questions, but this is the way we recommended that municipalities and regional organizations or land trusts or whoever is using the tool approach it. And that solar feasibility question includes interconnection and then the land forms. So next slide. So this is, and don't forget to bring in local knowledge. So next slide. So if you have plans in place, include those in your thinking already. And so this is what the tool actually looks like, right? On the left is some guidance, and on the right is, this is our first GIS data set that we have included in the tool. It's called the land cover map, and it can tell you, where the farmland is, where the developed areas are, and this is to answer the question of, well, what does our development in our town look like already? Next slide. And then in terms of opportunity areas, right, we do want to try and maximize the use of the low-hanging fruit as much as we can, at least as a start towards renewable energy goals. There are some information out there. We found large building footprints, and we found EPA's data set that has, even already includes repowering opportunities and makes estimations of how many megawatts could be located at a particular place, such as a mine or a closed landfill or a contaminated site. So those are our solar opportunity areas. And then on the next slide, again, where are those resources that we would want to avoid impacting? And then the last one, and this is something we are very proud of. The next slide, please. So in New York, the utilities are required to provide what's called hosting capacity, at least in terms of those distribution and three-phase lines that Joe mentioned. The New York utilities are putting out maps, and you can see here what happens is these overhead lines have a certain amount of connection potential, and that can serve as a proxy for planning. So we included that. And then I think I'll just finish it up really quick here, the last slide. And this is what it looks like on the tool for putting it all together. You can go to the various layers along the bottom. You can zoom in, you can zoom out, turn them on and off, and help to start your planning and go from there. So I will be quiet now, and hopefully we can finish up our Q&A and discussion for the day. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Audrey. That looks like a wonderful tool that I wish we had something similar here.
I would just mention the last slide that we skipped over. We do have a replication guide. So if people are interested in being able to build this kind of tool in your area, we're happy to answer questions, but that is available as well. Okay, I'm really quiet now. Thanks, everybody.
I'm going to invite all the panelists to turn their videos back on and join us for a brief Q&A. We've already gotten some great questions submitted, so I will start with those. But if there's anyone in the audience that hasn't asked their question yet, feel free to add that in the question box on the control panel. So I will start sort of way back at one of the issues that was discussed earlier on. Are any of you aware of some good example of states that have developed solutions to overcome some of those transmission and interconnection constraint challenges, and what might be some useful, applicable things that we could transfer over here to New Hampshire? I think that would be more for Dave and Joe.
Joe, you're on mute.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, in Massachusetts, we've seen some committees get formed with stakeholders, so engineers, solar developers, the utilities, DPU, and looking at interconnection and upgrades from a technical perspective. And a lot of times I've noticed, especially the larger EPCs and developers, they have so much knowledge, and as solar grows, we're seeing more experts moving over, maybe from having had a career in the utilities over to the solar side, and they bring so much knowledge, and we're seeing, you know, the solar community come up with ideas that might be less expensive. So kind of opening up the black box a little bit and letting some of these other experts weigh in on maybe more cost-effective ways, and then also working with policymakers and figuring out, you know, should some of these upgrades be rate-based. Another, you know, Massachusetts example is that we looked at what it would take to upgrade the grid in southeastern Mass so this 350 megawatts could come online, and it was something like 35 cents a month would be the impact on everyone's bill if it was all of the millions of dollars of work was rate-based. So having some of those policy discussions is important as well.
Yeah, Madeline, your question was framed as jurisdictions with positive examples. I think the list of negative examples, what not to do, is quite long. Those with positive is a much shorter list. So I think, in my experience, which is really just confined to the Northeast, so maybe there's states in other parts of the country that people can point to that are listening in. But in the Northeast, I think every jurisdiction is struggling with these issues to some degree or another, and if there's a sort of magic answer to this, I haven't seen it yet. Maybe others have, but I think, you know, in lieu of a magic answer, it really just boils down to a lot of conversation with regulators and utilities and the RTOs and just trying to move through the issues bit by bit. But it's a struggle.
Sounds good.
I know that Green Mountain Power had a GIS system that they made available to indicate where you could interconnect onto the system. And, you know, green, yellow, red, you know, don't even bother. There's nothing here. I think that, you know, instead of going through the interconnection process to find out that you can interconnect, you know, having more transparency in the beginning part of the process. And then I know from recently just listening to someone from ISO that they're, you know, the slow interconnection queue is something that they're really looking hard at to figure out how they can accelerate that.
Yeah, I know we don't currently have any hosting capacity data or mapping available, and it's something that we request often, and it's something that we were hoping to make some progress on under grid modernization, which has stalled at the commission. So we are trying to still collaboratively work with utilities to advance some of that data availability that I think would be really useful. The next question is for sort of all of you, whoever wants to jump in. Several of you have mentioned decommissioning. And so there was two questions related to that. One is solar really temporary? Aren't we gonna still want solar? And once the area has been developed for solar, the interconnection is there, aren't we just gonna replace the panels when the panels have outlived their life? And then the other question is, are any of you aware of examples of decommissioning that this has happened already, an example of successful decommissioning and return to another use, or is it just too early to have those examples yet?
I'm happy to start off on that. I think that nobody knows for sure what will happen 20 or 30 years from now with these projects. I think if they did continue to be solar, that would be kind of a wonderful thing. And certainly there could be some other type of energy that makes more sense at that point. But the question is accurate, that you have the interconnection infrastructure there, and there's a lot there working in your favor. So I'd love to think that these will continue to be clean energy sites. But if they're not, because no one knows for sure, I think it's important to plan what happens when eventually the system does need to be decommissioned, and who's responsible, and are there funds in place, because the reality is that once these systems are built, they're very much de-risked at that point, and they're basically annuity streams, and so they do get bought and sold over a 20 or 30 year period. And so I think having a bond in place is kind of best practice.
I would add that from the agricultural perspective, those are both questions that we field quite a bit. And often what I find myself responding is that if it's integrated, if it's co-located in dual use, then the concern is a lot less about it continuing to be solar. And in fact, that just means we can continue to benefit from clean energy. Even if the panels become replaced with more efficient panels, then that's an added benefit. And also, you know, the future probably holds more translucent panels, which would only increase the productional capacity. But aside from that, having a decommissioning bond in place with the municipality or whatever is sort of the best practice of the region and required by the state at some point, we hope it's sort of required broadly, is another way to ensure that if need be, the land can be returned if things don't work out, where it can continue to produce both.
Looking into my crystal ball, I like to think that the technology is changing so much that in 20 or 30 years, it might not be more efficient panels, because we're going to have roof like shingles and everybody can just do it on their own house, and it's going to be much small, you know, just like computers were like really big and they are really small. That's the way that I think of it. I think technology is going to take us in a direction that's going to change how we use the land regardless. But going back to the other question, I don't have any good examples yet of decommissioning and how that has worked. And they're still just in the building mode generally.
Yeah. Probably the last question we have time for, and then I'll encourage the audience to give us some feedback as well. Some of you have mentioned that if we did want to drive development away from green fields or forests or ag lands, that there's economic incentives necessary for that. What's needed for an incentive to make that effective in driving development? And I know it's a little bit hard to compare. I think, Emily, you mentioned a 6 cents adder. When we talk about adders, we also have to consider that here in New Hampshire, our base tariff for net metering, for example, and our value of RECs is not what they are in Massachusetts. And so I think, you know, as a developer, you're looking at the all-in value of the project. But I'd be curious, what are some effective incentives that have affected those?
I think reducing the regulatory risk is a huge one. Even though it might not monetarily work out to, you know, we're going to give you this amount of money, but if you can de-risk the regulatory process on that, I think that's a big incentive.
Yeah, I agree. In Massachusetts, DEP went through a permitting process where they really streamlined permitting for landfills, and they said, you know, this is a great use of space, we're behind this, and it's kind of an expedited permitting process, you know, as long as your loads aren't interfering with this, you know, there's all kinds of requirements, but if it's well engineered, it doesn't need to take a year to go through the permitting process.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time. So I'm going to mention 2 quick opportunities for folks to provide input directly to the state on topics related to this, there's currently an open comment period on the update to the state energy strategy. You can submit your comments to the Office of Strategic Initiatives. They are looking for broad input on anything related to energy policy in the state. So certainly everything that we discussed today is relevant. And the other one, Sherry mentioned that the Department of Environmental Services has guidance currently for large solar development and alteration of terrain permitting. They are planning on initiating a formal rulemaking later this summer. And so that will involve a lot of stakeholder input. So definitely look forward to participating in those. And I'll invite everyone as a follow-up. You can send it to us by email, or we can leave the webinar open for a little bit after we run out of time. To definitely get in touch with Clean Energy New Hampshire and let us know what topics we should recommend to the state when it comes to helpful next steps on smart siting and development of larger solar projects. Let us know how we can help. We're always, we're here to develop resources for developers, for towns, for all of our members. So certainly we welcome your input. I'll thank all of our panelists again for their helpful presentations and answering your questions. And thank you all for attending this event today.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.